No one expected children to become soldiers, not in the heart of Europe, not in one of the most educated nations on earth. And yet, by the end of World War II, Germany was fielding boys so young that their rifles looked oversized in their hands. Some couldn't even shave, some still had baby faces, and all of them were caught in a war they never fully understood. The story of German child soldiers is not just another dark chapter of the war. It's one of the most disturbing signs of how far a collapsing regime would go to keep fighting. Most people today imagine the Hitler Youth as a political organization, a place for marching, chants, and indoctrination. But in 1945, those same boys were being ordered to hold Panzerfausts, hide behind corners of ruined cities, and fire at tanks that could crush them without ever noticing they were there. But how did an entire generation of children become soldiers? How did boys who should have been playing soccer in the streets end up manning anti-aircraft guns and defending Berlin against the Red Army? Why did parents allow it? Why did commanders encourage it? And what did these boys actually experience when the war suddenly arrived at their front doors? To understand this, we must start long before the bombs fell and the armies crossed the borders. We must go back to the 1930s, when Germany was rebuilding itself after the First World War, and when a young Austrian politician was promising hope, pride, and a better future. That future, of course, would turn into one of the darkest periods in human history. The Nazi regime understood something that every dictatorship throughout history has known. If you want loyalty, shape the young. Control their education, control their worldview, and you control the nation. So from a very early age, German children were introduced to a world where obedience was a virtue, strength was expected, and sacrifice was honorable. They weren't taught to question. They were taught to follow. At first, joining the Hitler Youth seemed harmless. Boys wore uniforms, learned discipline, sang songs, and went camping in the countryside. Parents saw it as a healthy activity. Some even encouraged it. After all, Germany at the time was rising from poverty, unemployment, and national humiliation. Many adults wanted normalcy. They didn't see the danger yet. Over time, the organization began to change. Activities that once felt like Boy Scouts slowly became military preparation. Hiking turned into forced marches. Games turned into tactical training. Wooden rifles eventually became real ones. By the time war broke out, the transformation was complete. The Hitler Youth was no longer a youth club. It was a factory for producing loyal soldiers. But even then, in the early years of the war, boys weren't thrown into battle. At least not officially. Germany still had an army full of trained adults, and the high command believed victory would come quickly. Children were used for support roles, gathering scrap metal, helping with logistics, assisting during air raids, and performing drills that felt like exciting adventures rather than preparation for real combat. That illusion shattered in 1943. Germany's defeat at Stalingrad changed everything. For the first time, the German people realized the war was not going according to plan. Casualties were rising. Adult soldiers were dying faster than they could be replaced. As desperation grew, so did the government's willingness to blur the lines of age. The first step was the creation of the Flakhelfer program. Boys as young as 15 were assigned to anti-aircraft batteries. They were told they were helping defend their cities. They were told it was an honor to operate the guns that protected their families, and many believed it. They were patriotic, impressionable, and living in a country where propaganda filled every corner of life. So they stood beside older men and pulled the triggers of weapons powerful enough to tear through aircraft, and sometimes through the boys' own eardrums. Imagine being 15 and watching the sky fill with enemy bombers. Imagine feeling the ground shake as explosives rain down. Imagine knowing that if you made one mistake, your entire crew could be wiped out in seconds. These boys lived with that reality day after day. But the story doesn't end there. As the war dragged on, Hitler and his top commanders became obsessed with total resistance. Every town, every village, every household was expected to fight. If a man couldn't fight, a teenager would. If a teenager couldn't fight, a child would. The regime didn't see them as boys. It saw them as future men who should prove themselves worthy of their nation. By late 1944, the Volkssturm was formed, Germany's last-ditch militia. It consisted of old men, wounded veterans, and teenagers barely old enough to lift a rifle. Some were given uniforms, others wore whatever they owned. Some had weapons, others were handed Panzerfausts and told to get close to enemy tanks. Training lasted days, sometimes hours. Many went into battle without ever firing a shot beforehand. There are stories of 12-year-olds being handed rifles captured from the Eastern Front, rifles so big they had to rest the barrels on windowsills because their arms shook too much to aim. Some boys had never left their hometowns, only to be suddenly thrown into battles that would decide the fate of nations. Some children didn't fully understand what death even meant, yet they were ordered to defend bridges, streets, and bunkers. And some believed it, some felt pride. The indoctrination had been so complete that many boys genuinely thought they were protecting their homeland. They had been raised on stories of heroism and sacrifice. They wanted to prove themselves. They wanted to be seen as men, and the regime took full advantage of that innocence. But reality was merciless. The enemy they were asked to stop, hardened Soviet and American veterans, had survived years of brutal fighting. They had seen the worst horrors of the war and learned the harsh instincts needed to survive. These were not opponents that a group of frightened boys could stop. And despite their bravery, most child soldiers couldn't. They were overwhelmed, outgunned, outmatched. Still, in many cities, the front lines were defended largely by teenagers. In Berlin, some of the fiercest resistance came from boys who still wore their school uniforms underneath their Volkssturm armbands. They hid in basements, climbed onto rooftops, and crouched behind the rubble of buildings destroyed by years of bombing. They fired from windows, tossed grenades they barely knew how to use, and waited for tanks to roll through the streets. Tanks they had been told could be destroyed with a single well-aimed shot from a Panzerfaust. Some of them succeeded, many didn't. The tragedy is that most German children didn't join the war because they wanted to fight. They joined because the world around them gave them no choice. They were raised in an environment where loyalty was praised, questioning was punished, and war was glorified. They didn't know any different. They couldn't say. And by the time the truth became clear, it was far too late. But how did these boys actually feel when the war caught up with them? What went through their minds as they were handed weapons and told to defend positions already doomed to fall? What happened when enemy soldiers realized they were fighting children? And what became of the survivors once the war ended? For many of the boys forced into the final stages of the war, the moment they were handed a weapon was the first time they realized the world of patriotic songs and classroom slogans had nothing to do with real combat. Some of them had grown up thinking war was noble, even exciting. But the first time they heard artillery in the distance, the illusion shattered instantly. One former Hitler Youth member later said he joined the Volkssturm believing he'd be a hero. But the moment he saw a wounded soldier carried past him, missing an arm, soaked in blood, he felt his stomach twist. That was the moment he understood he wasn't walking into a storybook adventure. He was walking into hell, and he wasn't alone. Hundreds of thousands of boys across Germany felt the same punch of reality as the front lines closed in. The boys who were sent to the front had almost no real training. Many had fired only a few practice shots. Their officers were often retired soldiers who had been recalled to service or party officials with no combat experience. Orders were vague. Supply lines were chaotic. Ammunition was scarce. Some were told to collect weapons from fallen soldiers and make do with whatever they found. A boy might start the day with a Panzerfaust, then switch to a captured rifle, then end up unarmed as he ran for cover. Despite all of this, the regime insisted they fight with absolute loyalty, and many boys tried. Indoctrination is powerful, especially for children. They didn't want to disappoint their superiors. They didn't want to be seen as cowards, and many genuinely believed that if they didn't fight, the enemy would destroy everything they loved. Propaganda painted the Allies, especially the Soviets, as unstoppable monsters. That fear pushed many boys to hold their positions even when retreat was the only sane option. Then came the moment of first contact. For some, it was hearing the metallic clatter of tank treads miles away. For others, it was the roar of American aircraft sweeping overhead or the crack of a Soviet sniper rifle. That sound became etched into their memories. It was the moment they realized they were facing trained soldiers who had survived battle after battle. A group of teenagers defending a small bridge might hear the grinding approach of Sherman tanks long before they saw them. They would crouch behind stone walls or overturned carts, hands shaking as they clutched their weapons. Some whispered prayers. Others tried to steady their breathing the way their instructors had told them: straight back, deep breath, steady aim. But no amount of breathing exercises could prepare a child for the roar of an advancing tank column. Across Germany, encounters like this played out again and again. In some towns, resistance collapsed instantly. Boys would see enemy units approaching and simply drop their weapons. They weren't stupid. They knew the fight was hopeless. But in other places, fanatic officers threatened to shoot anyone who surrendered. So the boys fought because they were more afraid of their own commanders than of the enemy. When Allied soldiers realized they were facing children, reactions varied. Some froze in disbelief. Some shouted for them to drop their weapons. Others didn't even notice until the fighting was over and they approached the bodies or the prisoners and saw just how young they were. Many Allied troops described feeling sick to their stomachs, an emotion far different from the rage they felt facing adult German soldiers. One American infantryman wrote that taking a 13-year-old prisoner was the moment he truly hated the Nazi regime. Not because of what they did to us, he said, but because of what they did to their own kids. Many soldiers on the Allied side shared that feeling. They had children back home around the same age. Seeing a kid in uniform, terrified, exhausted, clutching a rifle too big for him, it wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy. But tragedy doesn't stop bullets, and the battlefield didn't pause for emotions. In Berlin, the fighting was the most brutal. The city was a maze of rubble, broken walls, collapsed buildings, and improvised barricades. The streets were filled with smoke, fire, and the deafening thunder of artillery. Boys were scattered across the city in tiny groups, defending intersections, guarding bridges, or hiding in cellars with Panzerfausts. They were told to wait until a tank rolled close enough, then fire at the tracks. Most of them never got the chance. One boy recalled crouching in a ruined apartment building with two friends, all of them barely 16. They had been given 3 Panzerfausts and told to stop a Soviet T column. Before the tanks even arrived, artillery began pounding the street. The building shook violently. Dust and plaster rained from the ceiling. One of the boys panicked and tried to run, but was pulled back by the others. They waited for what felt like hours. When the tanks finally appeared, the boys didn't even get a chance to fire. A shell hit the front of the building, and everything went black. Stories like that were common. Some child soldiers never even saw the enemy before being wounded or killed. Others spent days hiding in basements, listening to the distant rumble of battle and waiting for orders that never came. The chaos was overwhelming. Communication lines broke down, units collapsed. In some cases, boys were forgotten, left in positions no one bothered to check. But not all the stories were about hopeless last stands. Some boys surrendered the moment they had the chance. Many were grateful when enemy soldiers approached them, weapons lowered, telling them to drop their guns. There are accounts of teenage defenders walking out with their hands up, tears streaming down their faces, relieved that they didn't have to pretend to be brave anymore. Parents played a complicated role in all of this. Some begged their sons to stay home, to hide, to flee the city. Others felt powerless because local party leaders threatened families who tried to stop their boys from serving. Still others had been so heavily influenced by propaganda that they truly believed their sons should fight. Some parents were not present. Many fathers were already dead or missing. Many mothers were struggling to protect younger children, find food, and survive bombings. In one tragic incident, a mother tried to physically block her 14-year-old son from being taken by Volkssturm recruiters. She screamed and clung to him, refusing to let go. The recruiters pushed her aside and marched the boy away. She never saw him again. After the war, no record of him was found. Stories like that haunted Germany for decades. They still do. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, they began encountering more organized pockets of child soldiers. Some towns were defended almost entirely by teenagers. In one village, American troops found a group of boys dug into trenches along the edge of a field. Their helmets were too big. Their uniforms hung loosely on their bodies. When they were captured, the soldiers took away their rifles and found that many of them had almost no ammunition. They were supposed to fight tanks with empty rifles. Not all encounters ended peacefully. Some boys, terrified or brainwashed, fired on approaching troops. They had been told the enemy would torture them if captured. They had been told surrender meant death. In those moments, the soldiers returning fire had no idea they were shooting at children, and afterwards, many struggled with the memory. Despite everything, many of these boys showed incredible resilience. Children are adaptable in ways adults often aren't. Some of them found ways to cope with the terror around them. Others clung to friendships that formed in the ruins of their cities. A few even found moments of dark humor, laughing at the absurdity of being ordered to defend a destroyed street with a single grenade and half a magazine of ammunition. But behind the laughter was fear, deep, overwhelming fear. Fear of dying, fear of failing, fear of disappointing their leaders, their families, or themselves. These boys were trapped between an ideology they didn't fully grasp and a reality they couldn't escape. And while the war for Germany's children was horrifying, what came after the fighting stopped would be its own kind of struggle, one that lasted long after the final shots were fired. When the fighting finally stopped in 1945, the world expected silence, an exhale after years of chaos. But for the boys who had been forced into the last battles of the war, the silence was almost worse than the explosions. When the guns went quiet, they were left standing among ruins, surrounded by bodies, unsure of what came next. Many didn't even know if their families were alive. Others had no idea where they were. Some had been moved from town to town so many times that they were practically lost children by the end of it. For a shocking number of these young soldiers, the moment of surrender didn't feel like a defeat. It felt like waking up from a nightmare. Allied soldiers would sometimes approach them slowly, hands raised, speaking gently because they could see the fear in the boys' eyes. One American GI recalled capturing a group of teenagers in a Berlin cellar. He said the boys looked like they were expecting to be executed on the spot. When he offered them water instead, one of the boys burst into tears, so relieved he could barely speak. But the trauma ran deep. These weren't just kids who'd witnessed violence. Many of them had been told since kindergarten that they were part of a chosen generation, destined to rebuild a mighty empire. They had sung songs about sacrifice and loyalty. They had been told to die rather than surrender. And now, suddenly, everything they believed had collapsed in front of them. The uniform that had once made them feel proud now made them feel ashamed or terrified. One former child soldier said the hardest moment wasn't facing enemy tanks. It was facing the truth that everything he had been taught was a lie. "I didn't know who I was anymore," he said years later. "The person I thought I was had died before the war even ended." In many towns, the returning boys found their homes destroyed. Some wandered through ruins trying to recognize anything, an old shop sign, a chimney, a school building. Many had no parents left. Some families had fled before the front arrived. Others were killed in bombings. A few mothers searched for their sons in makeshift hospitals, morgues, or among wandering refugees. The reunions were emotional, heartbreaking, and sometimes painfully brief. A mother might throw her arms around her son, stunned that he was still alive, then immediately break down when she saw how thin he was, how hollow his eyes had become, how old his face looked despite being barely a teenager. These boys often didn't want to talk about what they had seen or done. Some couldn't, some refused, some remembered too much, and some remembered almost nothing at all. Then came the aftermath, disarmament, detainment, and the long, confusing process of re-entering civilian life. Many of the younger boys were placed in temporary camps, not as prisoners, but simply because no one knew what to do with them. They were given food, blankets, and medical checks. Some received basic counseling, though the concept of treating psychological trauma in children wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. At the time, most adults assumed the boys would get over it, eventually. But trauma doesn't fade just because people stop talking about it. The nightmares began for many of them within days. Some dreamed of tanks crushing buildings. Others relived being trapped in rubble or hiding in dark basements. A few dreamed of comrades who didn't survive. Some wet the bed for months afterward. Some had sudden panic attacks when they heard loud noises, and many boys shut down emotionally, becoming quiet, withdrawn, almost ghost-like in their own homes. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was trying to rebuild. Germany was divided, occupied, and struggling through hunger, shortages, and chaos. There were new rules, new governments, new expectations, but the boys who had been forced into service often didn't know where they fit anymore. They had missed school, missed years of normal development, missed the simple experiences that shape childhood. Teachers described some boys as disciplined but distant, polite but detached, brilliant in bursts but often distracted. Others struggled terribly, unable to focus, unable to relate to classmates, unable to cope with ordinary routines after living through war. And some were haunted by shame. They felt like criminals even if they had never fired a shot. They blamed themselves for surviving when their friends had not. They blamed themselves for supporting a regime they later understood was evil, even though they had been only children. One boy said he couldn't bring himself to wear anything resembling a uniform ever again. Even seeing a police officer made his heart race. Another said he couldn't walk past construction sites because the sound of metal hitting metal reminded him of tank treads. These weren't isolated reactions. They were widespread among German youths who had been militarized by the Nazi regime. But the healing didn't happen in a straight line. Some kids managed to integrate quickly. They threw themselves into school, apprenticeships, sports, anything that gave them structure. Others struggled for years. Some drifted into petty crime. Some isolated themselves. Some became obsessed with becoming good or useful, terrified of ever being manipulated again. Many developed lifelong anxiety, depression, or emotional numbness. A surprising number eventually wrote memoirs or gave interviews late in life, but most waited decades before they could talk about their experiences. They often said that shame kept them silent for so long, not shame of combat, but shame of being used. These boys weren't villains. They were victims of one of the most aggressive indoctrination systems in history. Yet not all of them saw themselves that way at first. Some had genuinely believed in what they were doing and had to confront the painful truth that they had been part of something far larger and far darker than they understood. That psychological shift, from certainty to confusion to guilt, was one of the hardest parts of their recovery. Then there was the political and cultural aspect. After the war, many adults didn't want to talk about the past. They were exhausted, traumatized, or afraid of being judged. So the children, who desperately needed to process what they'd been through, grew up in an environment where silence was the norm. Some families avoided any mention of the Nazis altogether. Others spoke only in whispers. This silence created a kind of emotional vacuum. Many young veterans felt alone, misunderstood, or cut off from their own history. Even the Allied forces, though generally sympathetic to child soldiers, had no clear system for dealing with them. Some were interrogated, some were dismissed with little follow-up. A few were recruited as translators or laborers. They were moved around, shuffled between camps or caretakers, often with no stability. And yet, despite everything, many of these boys grew up to lead normal, productive lives. They became carpenters, teachers, engineers, artists, parents, and grandparents. But even as adults, the shadow of the war followed them. Some avoided war movies entirely. Others couldn't stand fireworks on New Year's Eve. A few never forgave themselves for surviving. One former boy soldier described the rest of his life as divided into two beings, the boy who fought in the ruins and the man who tried to forget him. Another said he spent decades trying to convince himself that he had been too young to make moral decisions. But trauma isn't logical. Trauma doesn't care about age. Trauma plants roots deep inside and waits. Still, there were glimmers of hope. Many survivors found comfort in talking to other former child soldiers. They formed groups, attended meetings, or met over coffee to share memories. Over time, some even turned their experiences into lessons for future generations, warning about the dangers of extremism, fanaticism, and the manipulation of youth. They spoke in schools, wrote books, or shared stories with their own children and grandchildren. Some said the most healing moment in their entire lives was when a teacher or student asked them the simple question, "What happened to you?" Not "What did you do?" Not "Why did you fight?" But "What happened to you?" That small shift, from blaming to listening, made all the difference. Healing also came from the rebuilding of Germany itself. As cities were reconstructed, as schools reopened, as music and art returned, many former child soldiers found themselves surrounded by signs of life. They watched their country transform from ruins into a modern democratic state. For some, this gave them a sense of purpose. They felt like they were part of something meaningful, something entirely unlike the destructive ideology they had been raised under. But even as adults, they never forgot. They never forgot holding a weapon that weighed more than they did. They never forgot the fear of footsteps crunching through debris. They never forgot the sound of tanks in the distance. They never forgot the classrooms where they were taught to worship a dictator. And they never forgot the friends who didn't survive long enough to see peace. Their memories became warnings, silent reminders of how easily a society can lose its children when fear, fanaticism, and propaganda take control. Many of those child soldiers never forgot the moment the war finally came to an end. For some, it came with the distant roar of artillery falling silent. For others, it came when a foreign soldier, often American or British, pointed a rifle at them and realized with shock, he's just a kid. And for the boys themselves, it often came with a strange mix of fear, disbelief, and relief. Because for the first time in years, they were allowed, no, forced, to stop being soldiers. But that's the thing, you can take away a rifle in an instant. What you can't take away just as easily is the mindset that came with it. And so the final tragedy of Germany's child soldiers wasn't only what happened to them during the war. It was what happened after. The end of the war and their struggle. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, tens of thousands of boys, many only 13, 14, or 15 years old, were scattered across the ruins of a shattered country. They came home not as heroes, but as reminders of everything that had gone wrong. Their childhoods had been taken from them, and in many cases, so had their families, their schools, and their communities. Some returned to homes that no longer existed. Others wandered through destroyed cities, trying to find anyone they recognized. And millions of German civilians, exhausted, starving, traumatized, were in no condition to help them process anything. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Many of these boys felt ashamed, but also confused. Ashamed because the lies they had believed collapsed almost overnight. Confused because they had spent years being told they were the last hope of the fatherland, only to discover the truth too late. Some former Hitler youth recalled that the collapse of Nazi Germany felt like the collapse of their entire worldview. They weren't just losing a country. They were losing their identity. Imagine being 14 years old and discovering everything you were taught, everything you fought for, was a lie. What do you do next? A generation with no map. Post-war Germany faced a monumental task: denazification, re-education, rebuilding. But that process was never easy, especially when the children being re-educated had spent years in a system designed to overwrite their minds. Teachers had been indoctrinated, schools had been compromised, the entire subject had been twisted. So when Allied forces took control, they had to rebuild education almost from scratch. Former child soldiers sat in classrooms with blank expressions, while teachers explained concepts like democracy, individual rights, and freedom, ideas that had been banned or twisted beyond recognition under the Hitler regime. Some boys embraced it immediately, even gratefully. Others resisted, unable to reconcile their old world with the new one. A few felt betrayed, angry that adults had lied to them for so long. One former 15-year-old Volkssturm fighter later said, "The war ended, but no one taught us how to be children again." And that was one of the most haunting consequences of the entire system. These boys never truly learned how to grow up because they skipped the step where they learned how to simply be kids. The impact on the rest of their lives. Many former child soldiers carried the emotional burden into adulthood. Nightmares, guilt, anxiety. Not because they had committed atrocities, many never fired a shot, but because they had been part of something they didn't understand. Some avoided discussing the war for the rest of their lives. Others spoke openly, but struggled to explain how they ever believed in the propaganda. And for decades, German society wasn't sure how to treat them. Should they be pitied? Should they be blamed? Should they be forgiven? These weren't questions with easy answers. But here's what historians gradually came to understand. These kids were not young fanatics. They were children pulled into a machine bigger than themselves. Teenagers are swept up in a storm created by adults. And yet, many of them never fully forgave themselves. The final battles, last gasps of a dying regime. One of the darkest ironies of the war was that Hitler's regime, knowing it was doomed, continued recruiting children right up to the final days. In Berlin, 12 and 13-year-olds were instructed to set up roadblocks, run messages, and even sabotage tanks. These were not combatants. These were kids who should have been in school, thinking about games or friends, not survival. When Soviet troops entered Berlin, many German boys were shocked to see the reality. The soldiers they'd been taught to fear weren't monsters. Some Soviets gave children food. Some even offered comfort. And that moment, when an enemy soldier extended kindness, shattered years of propaganda in an instant. Not through argument, not through education, but through a simple act of humanity. That memory stayed with many of those boys for the rest of their lives. The long road to truth. In the decades after the war, Germany confronted its past more honestly than nearly any other nation in history. Museums, diaries, interviews, and documentaries all helped tell the story of how children had been used as instruments of war. And as time passed, former child soldiers began to speak out. About their fear, about their confusion, about the way they were manipulated, about the cost of blind obedience. Their testimonies became critical historical warnings. Because at the core of their stories lies a fundamental truth. When a government tries to turn children into weapons, it destroys not only the future of a nation, but the innocence of an entire generation. The lessons we can't ignore. Why does this matter today? Why does this story still resonate? Because history shows that indoctrinating young people is one of the most powerful and dangerous tools any regime can use. Because child soldiers didn't exist only in Nazi Germany, they exist in conflicts around the world even today. And because propaganda aimed at youth remains one of the most effective ways to shape society, sometimes for good, sometimes for unimaginable harm. The story of German child soldiers isn't just about the past. It's about warning signs, about how fear, nationalism, and manipulation can combine to push children into roles they never should have been forced to take. And it's about the importance of teaching young generations to think critically, to question authority, and to value human life over ideology. A generation that had to rebuild themselves. What happened to those boys decades later? Many became ordinary citizens, teachers, mechanics, farmers, and engineers. A few became activists, warning future generations not to repeat the same mistakes. Many simply tried to forget. Some became loving fathers precisely because they wanted to give their own children the peaceful childhood they never had. And some lived quiet lives, still haunted by memories of sirens, uniforms, slogans, and the constant expectation to be brave, even when they were terrified. They grew old. The world changed. And eventually, their stories faded from public memory, until historians began collecting them again before they were gone forever. Their voices, shaky, emotional, reflective, became some of the most powerful warnings against the dangers of militarizing youth. The final question. In the end, the story of German child soldiers isn't just about war. It's about what happens when a society fails its youngest. It's about how easily innocence can be twisted. And it's about how important it is for us, today, to recognize those patterns before they appear again. Because history has a habit of repeating itself when we stop paying attention. So here's a question for you. One that many historians debate even today. Who do you think bears the most responsibility for what happened to these children? The leaders who created the system, the officers who enforced it, or the society that allowed it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Closing message. Stories like this remind us that history is fragile and the lessons we learn from it are priceless. If this video gave you something to think about, if it opened your eyes to a part of World War II that's often overlooked, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story so more people understand just how deeply propaganda can shape the lives of the young. Thank you for watching, and remember, the best way to honor history is to learn from it.